If you take a look at me, you'd probably agree that I'm white. That would make me somewhat qualified to make a video about whiteness, because I am definitely white. As a very white guy of mostly German heritage, I'm sure no one would question my whiteness, especially not founding father Benjamin Franklin.
Why should the Palatine Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? The number of purely white people in the world is proportionately very small. All Africa is black or tawny, Asia chiefly tawny, America, exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so, and in Europe the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also, the Saxons only excepted, who with the English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. Why do you hate me, Ben Franklin? Am I not white enough for you?
This video is a historical exploration of the concept of whiteness, where it comes from, how it's been used over time, and how it's changed. Even if you don't agree with everything in the video, I invite you to stick around and see if you learn something. As you can see from Franklin's essay, many groups that we consider white in America today, like the Germans, the French, the Swedes, the Russians, the Swedes? Really, Ben? The Swedes? Were to him swarthy or dark. The point here is that even if someone is from Northern or Central Europe, they haven't always been considered white in America. Let's dive deeper into the concepts of whiteness and white identity and see if we can find out what white even means.
Part 1. Race and Whiteness.
To understand this, we need to understand that race is a social construct. That means how people view someone's race, whether it's white, black, Asian, etc., isn't determined by one's DNA, but rather how society views them. Meaning, I'm white because if you ask 10 people, 9 out of the 10 would say I'm white, with the 10th being Ben Franklin, of course.
If you look at this video here by Innuendo Studios, he illustrates this point by looking at Barack Obama. While he had one black parent and one white parent, society, not his DNA, has decided that he is the first black president. I recommend you give the video a watch, I'll link it up here.
In America, for example, you have the one drop of blood rule. This basically stated that if you had any traceable black ancestry, you were considered black. What this means is you could have someone with a majority of European DNA that is still considered by society to be black. In fact, not all people with any sort of African ancestry define themselves this way, and other countries don't always use this either. So it shows that the idea of race is malleable. It does change. Looking at the one drop of blood rule, we actually see that whiteness isn't so much defined by what it is, but rather what it isn't. Click here for a video by the channel Thought Slime to explore a less historical version of the same concept. By now, hopefully you're with me in the idea that race doesn't come from one's DNA or even ancestry, but rather how society perceives them. This isn't to say that race doesn't affect people. In fact, how society perceives one can affect how they're treated economically, socially, and politically. As a white person, I think it's time that we start to critically analyze even the idea of whiteness and white identity. For now, let's move on to some of the roots of whiteness in America, and let's see how it's changed over time.
Part 2. Bacon's Rebellion and Whiteness in America.
Let's begin by saying that institutionalized racism and slavery is not unique to the United States. It's also that racism and an acknowledgement that race existed did occur in the United States before the 1670s. In Edmund Morgan's work, American Slavery, American Freedom, he shows how in the Virginia colony before Bacon's Rebellion, there wasn't as much emphasis put on race or racial language, even in regards to slavery. Let's get some background on Bacon's Rebellion and see how it changed things in America.
The idea of white and its contrast with black gains more prominence after 1677. At this time in Virginia, there were a lot of social problems. The land was owned by a relatively small group of wealthy families, but most Virginians were lower class. This included black slaves, white indentured servants, and tenant farmers of all races. This produced a lot of social and economic tension, since land was valuable, but a small group of families had a monopoly on it. There were also tensions with Native Americans, as Virginian settlers kept encroaching into their lands, trying to find some property to call their own. Nathaniel Bacon led a group of militia to attack nearby natives, thereby taking class tensions and turning them into racial tensions. Bacon and his men then turned their eyes on Governor Berkeley. They blamed him for not allowing them to carry out reprisals against Native Americans and also for denying them the right to go seize native land. What made this event unique and dangerous in the eyes of the wealthy landowners was that it was an alliance of tenant farmers, European indentured servants, and black or African slaves. Morgan argued that before the 1660s and Bacon's Rebellion, it might have been difficult to distinguish race prejudice from class prejudice. He cites different racial groups in the lower classes working together and even cohabitating. If this united front of the lower classes turned their eyes to the landowners, they might threaten to destroy the whole tenant farming system or even the institutions of slavery and servitude. The result was that after Bacon's Rebellion, we see an increase in racialized language surrounding servitude and slavery, to make it less about class or land and more about white and non-white. This was put into law in 1705 when the Virginia House of Burgesses passed slave acts that worked to restrict black slaves, empower white owners, but most of all to socially divide white and black people. By driving a racial wedge between the lower classes, the wealthy landowners could keep these lower classes from uniting and turning on them.
To quote Morgan, the answer to the problem, obvious if unspoken and only gradually recognized, was racism. To separate dangerous free whites from dangerous black slaves by a screen of racial contempt. Bacon's Rebellion is important because it shows us that not only can the concept of whiteness change, but it can also change in importance. We see here that whiteness was weaponized and was used as a tool to divide lower classes by race. For a second time in this study, we see whiteness more defined by what it isn't rather than what it is. For now, let's look at examples for how it's changed over time.
Part 3. Why do you hate me, Ben Franklin? Germans and White Identity.
Ben Franklin's 1751 essay might sound surprisingly familiar when it comes to debates on issues of race and immigration. What did we ever do to you, Ben? He's worried about white Anglos becoming aliens in their own settlements by a darker group of people coming in and refusing to assimilate, but rather forcing their cultures and mannerisms on the whites who were already there, thus destroying white people and white culture. So there you go, that's founding father Benjamin Franklin, founder of the white genocide myth. I'm not going to cover that myth and disprove it because that video already exists. You can check it out here by Sean and I highly recommend it. And if you're one of those people who thinks that white genocide is actually happening, Ben Franklin spent his whole life waiting for it, and he's super dead and it still hasn't happened. It should sound pretty odd to us because these groups, the French, the Germans, the Swedes, the Russians, are definitely considered white today, but he considered them not only not white, but an existential threat to the idea of whiteness. That said, these same arguments, the lack of assimilation, the changing of complexion, and a loss of overall white character, are the same arguments you hear in the discourse about immigration today. Speaking of immigration, let's look at the Irish.
Part 4. The Irish and the Periphery of Whiteness. The Irish are another group that have been perceived as either white, non-white, or sort of partially white throughout American history. Irish immigrants in the 1800s, especially the majority of Catholic ones, faced a lot of discrimination in the United States. You even have the Know-Nothings and other nativists organizing political parties to limit or prevent Irish immigration. Let's examine some political cartoons. Here is one portraying the Irish as violent subhumans, and I hate to tell you, but this ape-like portrayal is not uncommon. This cartoon here does label the Irish as white nominally, but I think you can see that it's portraying them as less than human looking and comparable to Southern Black Americans. Pretty messed up, but it does illustrate the views of people at the time. And if you look at this one, this is literally like we must protect the future of our white children idea. I don't think I have to say why that's racist or white supremacist. While religion is a major factor, you can see that the Irish are at best portrayed as on the periphery of white, if not non-white.
In fact, in his book How the Irish Became White, Noel Ignatieff argues that the Irish use opposition to and violence against African Americans to distinguish themselves as white. We see again and again, whiteness isn't defined so much by what it is as by what it's not. We can see a violent example of this with the draft riots in 1863 in New York City. And although those had multiple causes, but we can still see this in the form of violence from Irish Americans against African Americans.
To borrow a quote from Sarah Hines in her article Not White, Not Quite, Irish Identities in the U.S. Census, and in Anne Pratchett's novel Run, who was white changed over time, and even groups could move between the core, periphery, or completely outside the scope of whiteness depending on circumstances.
Between distancing themselves from African Americans and enmeshing themselves with institutions like the civic service, police, fire, having different parades, etc., the Irish eventually moved from the periphery of whiteness into the core. They were successful in carving out a place for themselves as white by contrasting themselves against people who were black. Do you see the pattern about how we define whiteness yet? The fact is, when you hear people on the right talking about preserving white values, whiteness, or white culture, they're making the same arguments as Benjamin Franklin, but they're shooting at a moving target. They're not even arguing about the same white people with the same whiteness and the same white culture as Ben Franklin was. The definition of whiteness has already changed, and it's going to continue to change. They're trying to defend an artificial construct that exists mostly as a contrast to things that aren't white. How can people worry about or try to defend whiteness when it's not even really a defined concept?
Part 5. Why it matters today.
Let's run a thought experiment for a moment. Let's say you're a white guy and you've been promised that America is the land of opportunity. You were promised that if you got an education, you could get a good job, like a good union factory job. You were supposed to be able to buy a house at a reasonable interest rate, have a wife, 2.5 kids, third of a dog, the whole white picket fence lifestyle. But let's say, hypothetically, that promise was never delivered. You've seen factory jobs like yours get shipped off overseas by companies hoping to employ cheaper labor. Sure, you've been able to scrape by with other jobs, but your real wage never really seems to go up, even though companies are constantly bragging about record profits and you see CEOs getting pay raises. And still being hypothetical, let's say there was a big economic downturn recently, and while you had to struggle through it, the same people that run the financial institutions and businesses that have been hurting you have no punishment at all. In fact, some of them get bonuses or golden parachutes. If you watch certain news channels, you might be led to direct your anger at some sort of other, someone who isn't white. Maybe it's the immigrant you're concerned about coming over and taking a job, or siphoning what little money the government sets aside for social services. Maybe you're mad at people in other countries who have the factory jobs that used to be yours. Maybe this certain news channel has told you that there's migrant caravans coming and they're going to overwhelm you and whiteness is just going to disappear. But what if instead of getting mad at immigrants, you get mad at the businesses that are incentivized to hire them below standard fair wages because they're chasing profit? What if instead of getting mad at foreigners, you get mad at the businesses which move factories because they're chasing higher profits and want to pay below market wages? Going above the businesses, what if you direct your anger at the whole system? The system that constantly prioritizes profit over people. Maybe if you direct your anger there, you'll start looking around and realize that you have a lot more in common with workers who may or may not be your color rather than CEOs who are your color. Maybe now that you know that race is a social construct and the idea of whiteness is artificially constructed and subject to change, maybe you don't go the route of Bacon's rebellion and turn your anger against someone of a different race. Maybe you lash out at the whole system that created these depressed wages and these moving jobs. Maybe we don't have to relive Bacon's rebellion. After all, as Edmund Morgan put it, resentment of an alien race might be more powerful than resentment of an upper class. But what if we chose differently this time? Thank you guys for watching. I definitely went a different route this time and tried to have some social commentary and the history match up. I hope you enjoyed it, and even if you didn't, I hope you learned something. I don't normally do this, but I do want to point out that I do have a Patreon. The link is in the description and in my channel. If I'm doing more controversial topics like this, ones that take different props and things, and I want to get a little more fancy with my videos, it is going to take more time and more funding, so I would really appreciate it if you guys check that out. If not, I always appreciate it when you guys like, comment, or subscribe. That really helps out as well. I do have a script for a World War II video coming out next, so if this was a little too far away from what you guys like, I will go back to my roots just a bit, but you'll notice something different about that one too. As always, stay excited about history, but let's also see what it can teach us about today.